them to be led by the Ateneo Chamber Singers. And after the anthem, we ask you to remain standing for the invocation to be led by Father Jose M. Cruz of the Society of Jesus, who is also the Dean of the School of Social Sciences.
Ang bituin na araw niya kailan pang may magigiling lupa ng araw ng buwan ng ating pagsinta buhay ay langit sa piling mo ang hindi kaya na pag may mga api ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Belong to a variety of religious traditions. May I invite you for us to call blessings on this Catholic sacrament. We thank you, Lord, for calling us into a life of the mind and for summoning us to transform ourselves in this world according to your design. Release us from whatever dulls the mind, shields it from recognizing when it does not understand, and pulls it back from venturing into the unfamiliar. Make us desire to be present intellectually where competence and compassion are needed. Provide signs for those who do not have signs. Provide skills for the unskilled, and to be a voice for those who do not have the resources to promote and safeguard their rights. Make our senses keen to your prodding, to make of ourselves and our work evermore the image of your love. We ask this in Christ's name.
Thank you. Please be seated. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Ateneo de Manila University. We'd also like to welcome all of our viewers watching live via our webcast this afternoon. Now, let us please welcome Mr. Manuel V. Pangilinan, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Ateneo de Manila University, who will give us the welcome remarks.
Professor Kydland, Mr. Ateneo, Mr. Montella, who's the Chair of Religious, Mr. Uwe Morris, Chair of International Peace Foundation, Dr. Antoinette Palma Angeles, Academic Vice President and OIC of the University, Ambassador Alberto Rosario, Excellencies of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Board of Trustees of the Ateneo, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and friends of the Ateneo. It's my privilege to warmly welcome you to the keynote lecture of Dr. Kydland at the Ateneo de Manila University. It is an honor as well to host this event, and we are happy to see the Academy, business, as well as the big student contingent present here today. This afternoon will be interesting and insightful, especially for us in business and banking, and even for the Pinoy everyman. Dr. Kydland's work in economics, expository and systematical, and those of Professor Edward Prescott, with whom we shared the 2004 Nobel Prize, and landmarks in shaping monetary policy, particularly encouraging the independence of central banks, the driving forces behind dynamic business cycles, and the importance of mundane decisions made daily by firms, businesses, individuals, and even governments. We would like to thank the International Peace Foundation and its founding chairman, Mr. Uwe Morowitz, and Mr. Jaime Augusto Zabel de Ayala for bringing the program Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, and giving our people and our students a chance to interact with Nobel laureates. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pangilinan. Today's event is brought to us by Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace, facilitated by the International Peace Foundation. To give a message on behalf of the Bridges, please welcome Mr. Jaime Augusto Zabel de Ayala, Philippine Chairman of Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace.
Mr. Pangilinan, Professor Palma Angeles, Deans of the school, faculty members, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to all of you, and welcome also to this third in a series of lectures by Nobel laureates in this ASEAN-wide series of events entitled Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. We are really delighted to be holding this Bridges event here today at Ateneo, an institution proud of its heritage as a leading intellectual center run by the Society of Jesus, equally proud as a 468-year-old organization which has made many historic contributions to the world. Established, as many of you know, as a religious order of just 10 men in the year 1540, led by the intrepid Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuits produced great men such as the linguist, mapmaker, and philosopher Matteo Ricci, and Francis Xavier, the man credited for opening much of Asia to the society. Names which are now forever honored on the grounds and buildings of this really quite beautiful campus. The Ateneo in the Philippine province of Jesuits has also made some great contributions to the society. One of them is the new Jesuit Superior General, Father Adolfo Nicolas, only the 29th successor to St. Ignatius in the Jesuits' rich and long history. A Spaniard by birth, Father Nico spent much of his life as a Jesuit in the Far East, including major assignments here on the Loyola campus as director of the East Asian Pastoral Institute from 1978 to 1984, and more recently as president of the Jesuit Conference of East Asia and Oceania as the major superior of the Arupe International Residence. Even when he was based in Japan, he maintained a Philippine connection, caring for Filipino migrants in a parish in Tokyo. Ateneo, I think, can rightfully be proud to have played a role in the life and career of the leader of the world's largest Catholic order. The Bridges series is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including the country's major universities. From November 2007 to April 2008, Bridges is being continuously held in the Philippines and Thailand, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, and of course, economics. All of this would not have been possible without the vision and untiring efforts of Mr. Uwe Morowitz, Chairman of the International Peace Foundation, for conceptualizing and bringing to reality the Bridges program. And we're delighted to, of course, have met Mr. Horowitz here with us today. It is mainly through his efforts that the Nobel laureates have come together and agreed to engage in lectures and conversations in ASEAN, which already illustrates the power of international cooperation within ASEAN and the rest of the world to bring together a program of this quality. The topics of the ongoing events deal with the overall theme of building a culture of peace and development in a globalized world. It covers a wide range of issues in the fields of politics, economy, science, culture, and the media. They especially highlight the challenges of both globalization and regionalism and its impact on development and international cooperation. Over the next 3 months of this program, different Nobel laureates will visit the country separately to conduct public lectures, seminars, workshops, and dialogues hosted by educational institutions in Manila, Cebu, and Davao. This intercultural and transdisciplinary approach towards peace provides an opportunity for dialogue where representatives of science, politics, economy, culture, religion, the media, and certainly youth can meet, share viewpoints, listen to each other, and find mutual ways of understanding and cooperation. This pluralistic approach ensures that different groups in our divided world can act in a highly interdependent manner to understand and help solve our societal challenges. In our first 2 meetings of this series, we focus on economics and physics. While one may look at these topics as relevant as mere coincidences to the challenges that face us today, I interpret them as a testament to both the timeliness and timelessness of the key messages they represent and to the brilliance of the speakers who present them. In our first lecture with economist Robert Mandel on fitting globalization into the National Development Strategy, he spoke about optimum currency areas and on a policy framework for economic stability under fixed and flexible exchange rates, topics of tremendous interest today in the face of foreign exchange rate volatility. In our second lecture, physicist David Gross spoke of science's contribution to building up our stock of knowledge in the world and the way in which it works. More intriguingly, he described science as flourishing within and reinforcing systems of political and social freedoms because scientific discovery is based on empiricism, openness, transparency, and questioning. It was a fascinating lecture. Presenting a scientific view of the world's environmental condition, he even questioned the economic paradigm of growth, positing that perhaps our present and future leaders should reconsider this strategy for development, an unquestionably contrarian view to those engaged in running countries and businesses. Today's meeting takes us back to the field of economics and comes at a particularly important time not only for the Philippines, but for the rest of the world as well. With trouble brewing on several economic fronts, from the subprime problems in the US to high energy prices worldwide, the questions are we on the cusp of a new business cycle? For the Philippines, we're coming off a year of the highest economic growth in more than 3 decades. Yet, we still see poverty in our midst and migration steadily increasing as more people seek opportunities abroad. What do these trends tell us about our own economic cycle? One of our speakers' specialties is on analyzing the driving forces of business cycle. His views will be important for all of us here today. I'd like to thank Ateneo and all of you here today for taking part in this program. May it help us facilitate the culture of peace and development through dialogue. In this spirit, we welcome the 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Kydland, who has agreed to come to the Philippines and support bridges. Certainly, I look forward to his speech. And again, thank you to Ateneo most especially for hosting this event here today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zabel. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now please welcome Dr. Fernando T. Aldaba, Chairman of the Department of Economics and currently the President of the Philippine Economic Society, who shall introduce the keynote speaker.
Good afternoon. The keynote speaker, Professor Kydland, is a 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics at the Department of Economics of the University of California, in Santa Barbara and at the Pepper School of Business.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dobel. Ladies and gentlemen, let us now please welcome Dr. Fernando T. Aldaba, Chairman of the Department of Economics and currently the President of the Philippine Economic Society, who shall introduce the keynote speaker.
Good afternoon. The keynote speaker, Professor Kydland, is a 2004 Nobel laureate for economics at the Department of Economics of the University of California in Santa Barbara and at the Pepper School of Business at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. Professor Kydland received his BA in economics from the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration and his PhD in economics from Carnegie Mellon University. He joined the faculty of the University of California in Santa Barbara in 2004, where he holds the Jeff Henry Chair in Economics after previous appointments at Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Texas at Austin, and the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration. He is a research associate for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, Cleveland, and St. Louis, and a senior research fellow at the IC2 Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. He is an adjunct professor at the Norwegian School of Economics and Business Administration and has held visiting scholar and professor positions at, among other places, the Hoover Institution and the Universidad Torcuato de Montella in Buenos Aires, Argentina. He was elected a fellow of the Econometric Society in 1992. Professor Kydland was awarded the 2004 Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences jointly with Professor Edward C. Prescott of the Arizona State University. Professors Kydland and Prescott received the Nobel Prize for their research on business cycles and macroeconomic policy. Their studies on the driving forces behind business cycles and the time consistency of economic policy have become important topics in macroeconomics and have largely influenced the reforms of central banks and the design of monetary policy in many countries. By integrating the theory of business cycles with the theory of economic growth, Tim Kydland and Edward Prescott showed that supply-side factors such as changes in oil prices may also have far-reaching effects. This is contrary to early research that emphasized macroeconomic shocks on the demand side of the economy. Professors Kydland and Prescott laid the groundwork for more robust models of business cycles by regarding them as the collective outcomes of countless forward-looking decisions made by individual households and firms regarding consumption, investments, and labor supply. Their journal article, Rules Rather Than Discretion, the Inconsistency of Optimal Plans, argues that inconsistent monetary policies advocated by authorities may often lead to inflationary trends, and that a set course of action laid out for the long run is clearly a better option. In effect, having an independent monetary authority or a central bank that promotes an explicit policy is a better way of monetary management than having one that is reactionary. Kydland and Prescott's findings have turned out to be robust and convincing enough to push nearly all governments to adopt independent central monetary authorities. Their studies also established the foundations for an extensive research program on the credibility and political feasibility of economic policies, and also shifted the practical discussion of economic policy away from isolated and specific policy measures towards the importance of institutions in policy making. More recently, Professor Kydland has conducted research in the role of monetary policy for business cycles. Yet, he has also studied Ireland and Argentina in the belief that there are a lot of insights for policymakers to learn from the experience of policy successes and failures of these two countries. Aside from being a top-notch economist and academic, Professor Kydland is also a music aficionado and a fitness enthusiast. He fosters a deep interest in blues music, plays and watches soccer, and has run the marathon 4 times. To top it all, he rides a Ducati motorcycle. Please welcome Professor Dean Kydland.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I can see there are lots of students here, and I'm especially happy that so many of you have turned out for this on this occasion. My wife Tanya and I have been very happy to come along on this trip. I thank everyone involved in arranging everything so smoothly in Bangkok and also now here in Manila. It wasn't a given, of course, that we could make it. I never leave the continent without my wife agreeing to come along, and she did, in fact, agree to come on this trip. So you can also thank her for being here. It's with a certain amount of trepidation that I include the word peace in the title, because I'm not really a researcher on peace. What are my qualifications? At the same time, I have been fortunate enough to be involved in events in the past 3 years dealing with thinking about peace and, it turns out, economic development. I was invited in the spring of 2005 for the first time to a conference arranged by Elie Wiesel, jointly with King of Jordan, to take place in Petra, Jordan. And we have been there again the following 2 years, and the 4th annual conference will take place in June of this year. At this conference, primarily for Nobel laureates, but other experts such as higher government officials and otherwise, we are divided into 4 groups. By the way, the typical title of this conference is either Saving the World, or last year it was called Building a Better World. At this conference, we have been divided into 4 groups, and I've always been in the group on economic development. And so it seems clear that Elie Wiesel considers economic development an important prerequisite for conditions of peace. And I agree entirely with that. Everything I've learned, especially in the past 3 or 4 years, have convinced me of that. In addition to that, having been at those conferences, I suppose the only other qualification I could point to is I'm a Norwegian. And Norwegians are known to travel over the world and try to broker peace. They have been to several places in the world as negotiators. And of course, when Alfred Nobel decided to make peace one of his prizes, he didn't trust the Swedes to hand them out. That duty is given to the Norwegians. So let me start with some motivating charts. it seems like kind of an idiosyncratic collection of countries. We have real GDP per capita for a number of countries. The top one is a national benchmark, the United States, a few other countries, covering the period from 1950 to about 2005. It's a tough problem to make GDP per capita comparable across countries with different currencies or different purchasing power of the currencies. These numbers are taken from so-called World 10 tables from an organization that has done their best to make the numbers comparable across countries. There's always debate about how comparable they are, but for my purpose, it doesn't really matter. For my purpose, it's the big differences across some of these tables or some of these numbers that are illustrated. And you'll see, for example, well, I have put the Philippines in among these tables. The Philippines, I don't know if everyone can see the stuff. Can you see the dot in the back? Otherwise, no point in using it. But here's the Philippines. Not much up and down in that picture, so it doesn't seem like the business cycles have been so pronounced. There was a bigger fluctuation in the country from which we just came, Thailand, where there was a big drop in the after 1997. The thing to say about the Philippines, I suppose, is one would wish this curve to be steeper. Now, and that's exactly the type of thing I'll be talking about here. What are the factors that could make to make these curves at least somewhat steeper and maybe not so much up and down in the curves? One country you may make a note of is this teal-colored curve. That's Argentina, and I'll get back to that country later. Argentina started off not being so far behind the major countries in the world. If I'd gone back 100 years or 120 years, Argentina would have been up there among the top 5 or 6 countries. And so one reason I'm going to talk a little more about Argentina, as was mentioned in the introduction, I think one can learn a lot from observing the policies that have been carried out in countries that have done poorly, such as, unfortunately, Argentina. And I would also use that as an example, a country that has done spectacularly in the past 20 years. So we may take a note of that curve. Here's a plot on the same scale. Notice that in both of these first plots, the income per capita goes on a scale from 0 to 40,000. Here we see what has happened, for example, at various times there have been conflicts. There have been episodes that are about as far from peace as can be. The country among these, the best performing countries are Cameroon and Lesotho. Lesotho is it sits there. It's a tiny country. It sits there in the middle of South Africa, and that's a country in which, for most of these countries, if I had made a picture in real income per capita, the curves would have looked almost identical. For the United States, real income is about the same as real GDP per capita. For Lesotho, they're actually doing better than this picture shows, because income is one of the textbook examples of where the difference between GDP and income can be pretty high. And the reason is that many inhabitants of Lesotho, they work in South Africa, they cross the border, and then they bring home their salaries. So the income is higher than what's being produced within their borders. So Lesotho does reasonably well. But you see several countries that are doing very poorly. There's Liberia, the dark blue, there's Burundi, Congo, the two Congos. I have Chad in this picture. Chad is a country that ran into trouble only this past week. And who knows what this picture will look like in 5 or 10 years if they cannot solve those problems. So I'll use these pictures as motivations, as suggestive that there is a connection between peace and economic development. And now I'll talk in more detail about this very wide topic. And because it's such a wide topic, in 45 minutes I cannot really cover such a broad aspect of it. I'll choose to talk about issues that are fairly close to my research. I get nervous if I have to go too far beyond what I have researched myself, and so that's part of the choice of the selection of topics. A quick overview of the talk is I'll give it will be somewhat essential to give you a sense of what the framework for modern macroeconomics is. I'll talk about something that I think it was touched upon in the introduction, and I'll talk about this issue of rules versus discretion. It's an issue from one of the two papers cited by the Nobel Committee. And what I'll try to do is give you a sense of the fundamental reason for this issue, for the resulting potential policy inconsistency over time. I'll give you a few acute examples, and then I'll give you the lessons I promised from Argentina and Ireland, and finally I'll make some general comments, some general remarks about the factors that either foster or hamper economic development. This framework, I suppose that was one of the things cited by the Nobel Committee, the Prescott and I coming up with this way of modeling the macroeconomy. It's in big contrast to the types of models that used to exist in the 60s and the 70s. What Prescott and I did was we put people into the models. We made an explicit description of the decision problems facing people, and these decision problems are very dynamic. They are forward-looking. Many of the most important decisions in facing people, they're forward-looking. The contrast with the previous framework was, of course, all macroeconomic models try to summarize what people do in the aggregate, but the previous framework did it in the form of many equations. For example, a consumption equation, an investment demand equation. Consumption equation, I'm simplifying a little bit, but it might be something that said, if your income goes up by $1,000, your consumption goes up by $900. Well, if you think about the economics of such a problem, it's clear that you cannot make such a blanket statement. It's got to make a big difference if that income, the increase in income as being proposed in the so-called rescue package for for the United States, now associated with the decline in activity associated with the so-called subprime mortgage crisis. That rescue package is, it's emphasized, is supposed to be temporary. In other words, a temporary reduction in taxes that will result in additional income. I would predict that the increase in consumption spending resulting from that will be no more than about 10%. If it had been a permanent increase, then most likely about 100% of it would be spent. And so that's, with a temporary increase, most of it will be saved. That's an example of the importance of the forward-lookingness of modern macroeconomics. So people are characterized by the preferences over goods, goods and services, let's say, and leisure into the indefinite future. They are constrained in their behavior by their budget constraints. From the point of view of the economy as a whole, it's constrained by their resources. Another important resource taken into account in these models is time. Very important resource, as I'm sure you all understand. We also need a description of the business sector, because the business sector, in some sense, provides a description of the capacity of the economy at every point in time to produce stuff, to produce the consumption goods, to produce the so-called investment goods that will result in future capacity to be augmented. And we often do that in the form of what we call the agri-production function. It describes the nation's technology for converting the two major inputs, capital in the form of factories, machines, office buildings, and so on the one hand, and labor input, the hours of work by all the workers in the economy, into goods and services, into consumption goods, into investment goods, and so on. Now, the economy, typical economies have become better at doing this over time. And this ability to do so more efficiently over time, to think of or to invent better production processes, maybe to produce more efficient machines, to produce better goods, that ability we can call technological change. And that's such an important factor. It's such an important factor for the development of economies. As you can see, I put that in boldface letters. And I do think a little more broadly about technological change than what the words might say. It's not just research and development, innovation, and so on, especially at the business cycle frequency. Many things that happen in the economy could be as if there was a shock or a change in the technology, change in the ability to convert capital and labor into goods and services. The old shock, it turns out, was as behaved or resulted in had the effect on the ability to produce as if it had been a negative shock to the technology level. There could be changes in the nature of contracting between businesses and workers. There could be a change in the provision of infrastructure. Changes in regulations could play a role. I would always, especially in Latin America, use the example of banking panics. Banking panics have occurred from time to time. They occurred in the United States in the Great Depression in the early 30s. They have occurred in Argentina and other Latin American countries. And when they occur, usually they have a negative effect on the banking system, on the financial, the ability to financially intermediate, as we say in the economic language, intermediate between the savers often millions of people saving small amounts, and the investors who put these sums of small amounts into big factories and machines and so on. Very important function, and if their behavior is affected, for example, through a banking panic, or now the subprime mortgage crisis, it will be as if you throw sand into an otherwise well-functioning machine, and it will be as if there's a technological negative shock. These models I use primarily to ask quantitative questions. I think of them as a measuring device, and I think they have answered many interesting questions over time. Computational ability power has made it possible to ask a wider set of questions that requires that you introduce a lot of detail about household behavior over the business cycle, or even these days, family behavior is all the rage in the research. It turns out there are many questions one can ask whose answers hinge on interactions or what generally is called family behavior. Now, of course, central to this talk is going to be the role of the government. And the government can be introduced as a third player. In addition to the household sector in the aggregate and the business sector, there's a government. The government, of course, serves a very important function. There are services that would not have been provided if the government hadn't taken them over. National security or security within cities or security anywhere is a good example of such a function. But there are many other functions served by the government. The government provides services to people, and to finance these services, they have to get revenue from somewhere, much of it in the form of various types of taxes. The government is under a budget constraint. If the taxes fall short of the services paid for, governments can typically borrow in return for promising to pay back later. Now, what Prescott and I did in that paper was we thought of a simplified various types of taxes. The government is under a budget constraint. If the taxes fall short of the services paid for, governments can typically borrow in return for promising to pay back later. Now, what Prescott and I did in that paper was we thought of a simplified framework. You can think of it as a stylized framework. You can think of it as imagining that the government can formulate kind of a welfare function, a function that it wants to maximize, or I call it here an objective function. In the description of household, we describe preferences in the form of a utility function, and this utility function covers today and far into the future. Similarly, we could imagine the government's objective being such a function, representative of the people of the nation. I'm going to assume that this function is unchanging, regardless of what government is in power. Let's imagine that we abstract from the fact that different governments might want to change the objective, and then you can simply think of that as an additional complication on top of what I'm about to tell you. So imagine the objective function of the government is unchanging. The government is subject to budget constraints, just like you and me. Here's the theoretical result we discovered, and that is that optimal policy, the policy resulting from the government calculating what the outcome should be, the outcome maximizing that objective function over time, that optimal policy generally is inconsistent over time. And it implies, or it requires, a commitment mechanism in order for it to be implemented. If no such commitment mechanism exists, suppose the government succumbs to the inconsistency, then, as we showed through some graphic examples, one in the context of monetary policy, one in the context of fiscal policy, the outcomes can be very bad. What's the fundamental reason? Well, this optimal policy calculated by the government, if it does it right, it will take into account the effect this policy has on the behavior of the millions of people and the thousands of businesses far into the future. There are many such decisions by the government that play a role for people's decisions or businesses' decisions. An obvious example is investment behavior. You build a factory, you spend millions of dollars today, and the revenue comes in the form of, while you sell the resulting goods you produce, you sell them over maybe the next 10, 20, 30 years, for as long as this so-called capital stock is productive. So this revenue is uncertain. Not only do you have to think about how productive the economy is going to be far into the future, but there's the additional source of uncertainty, and that is because what matters to you is, as an investor, it is how much revenue or income do I get after the government has taken its share. That's really what matters. And so then you have to think about, what is that share? What is that tax rate that the government will apply to my income, to my revenue? So that's an example, but there are lots and lots of such examples, including also if you think rationally about the decision to accumulate more or less education, more or less human capital, the same kind of considerations can come into play. So you take that into account, and in that optimal plan. Now let's fast forward, say 5 years. Suppose the economy has been chugging along, investments have been made, etc. The government sits down and they decide to recalculate this policy. Now, remember, the policy is already in effect. It's in effect for maybe another 5, 10, 20 years. If it's recalculated, you'll find a completely different policy. You may find that while at time zero I had promised a tax rate on capital income of 10%, now it seems optimal to say, oh, we might want to tax the next year's or the following year or the following couple of years capital income at the rate of 50%. The thinking being that these factories will not be closed down; they will still, most of them will still continue to operate. It seems like a cheap way for the government to generate its revenue. Now, to counteract the effect that future investors will worry about these higher taxes, they might say, oh yes, and we'll reduce the taxes again back to the old level in 2 or 3 years. The end outcome is likely to be that higher tax rates than are optimal for the society. In the case of monetary policy, what we showed in our example was the economy is likely to end up in higher inflation rates than is in the interest of society. So I already talked about the examples where the temptation is the greatest. The temptation could be to increase the tax on physical and human capital, It could be to partially renege on government debt through surprise inflation. That's something that's happened often in Latin America. Debt was issued at a nominal interest rate, maybe in local currency, and then a hyperinflation hits, and the debt becomes essentially worthless to the holder of the debt. Meantime, from the point of view of the government, it's essentially costless to pay it back. It's costless in real terms. So all of this suggests that there is an incentive that, from the point of view of society, it'd be nice if we had a mechanism to tie the government's hands so that this uncertainty about the future resulting from or coming from government behavior, that it's removed. In the case of monetary policy, these are three examples of such mechanisms that have been tried at various times. The gold standard dates back to mostly to the 19th century, and it lasted for a long time, but fell apart in the finally in about 1930. The currency board, it's an interesting example because it was tried in Argentina. The example I like to use in my talk. Argentina, as you'll see graphically, fell on very hard times in the 1980s. So badly that that decade is often called the lost decade. There were hyperinflations. Someone told me, I have forgotten these numbers, but someone told me yesterday the inflation rate got up to 3,000% annually in 1989. Just an astounding number. That's not the world record. Bolivia had even higher inflation rates in the 80s. So when Carlos Menem took over in about 1990, he figured he had to do something to increase the credibility of Argentina. And that's when he came upon the idea of the currency board to accumulate dollar reserves, promise that you will be willing to exchange the peso 1-for-1 with a dollar. That worked for a while, for about 8 years, and then it fell apart. My quick take on why it fell apart, the key reason was that monetary policy cannot be viewed completely in isolation from fiscal policy, especially not in this case. And in the case of Argentina, what they did not solve was the fiscal situation. In Argentina, the provinces can borrow. They're not subject to a balanced budget requirement like the states, most of the states of the United States. They can borrow, and towards the end of the 1990s, it became clear that they would not be able to pay back their loans. They came running to the federal government who bailed them out, and then the federal debt ballooned dramatically. And for whatever reasons, the government decided they could not hold the line, and then the peso is now, well, it takes about 3 pesos to buy $1. Now the mechanism that's more prevalent today is the idea of an independent central bank to try to isolate monetary policy as much as possible from political pressure by having a competent organization conduct monetary policy and try not to succumb to the pressure that will always fall on the central bank from politicians. And this has been used to various degrees in countries. Someone calculated an index of independence across nations on a scale from 1 to 5, and the correlation between the the degree of independence and the inflation environment being benign, it's very high. countries have changed, in fact, over the past 10 or 20 years. Bank of England is an example where monetary policy was under the central government. The Bank of England was made independent in 1997. Scandinavian countries have become more independent. Argentina is an example where the central bank is absolutely not independent. There have been times when the head of the central bank, years, when the head of the central bank was replaced half a dozen times in 1 year. Unbelievable. And it shows in the inflation experience of Argentina. So what many central banks, especially those that are fairly independent, do these days, they try to make their policy transparent. They make clear what their inflation target is, and they try to follow that target. That has worked pretty well, although one might say that they haven't really been put to the test because the business cycle environment has been quite benign since the early to mid 90s. We seem to be going into a rougher period now, and we'll see how well this works when they're really put to the test. This last point is a little subtle, and so in the interest of time, I think I'll skip it and instead invite you to come and talk to me about it afterwards. So let me talk about the main forces for economic growth. Inflation, the inflationary environment, I don't think is a major force. I mean, whether inflation is on the average 2% or 5%, it's not a big factor in economic growth. It's when the inflation rate really shoots up where growth can suffer. I think the main driving forces they are innovative activity and technological change, but that cannot be the only factor. There's got to be accumulation of productive ability to take advantage of the innovations, to take advantage of the research and development, to take advantage of what's being discovered. We need incentives to invest in this new capital, and that's where the government policy may be beneficial, or it could be detrimental to such growth. I'll give Argentina as an example where government policy has, in my mind, clearly been detrimental to long-run growth, and then I'll use Ireland as an example of the opposite. So here's a picture of what has happened in Argentina in the past 50 or 55 years. You saw the first picture, so you know that even over this period, in the early portion, it wasn't as if Argentina was growing that fast, but by the standard of the whole last 50 or 60 years, the first 30 years were pretty good. This, by the way, is in proportional scale, and so 1 centimeter increase up here is the same percent increase as a 1% centimeter increase down here. In 1980, a Great Depression ensued. GDP per working age person, which is what this chart is about, fell more than 20%. Just an astounding drop in economic activity. Then, as you can see, the economy recovered during most of the 1990s, and then there was another drop from 1998 to about 2002 or 2003. This drop was just as large, if not larger, and it took place over a shorter period of time, over 5 years instead of 4 or 5 years, instead of 10 years in the 1980s to write a paper for a conference, to write a paper about the 1980s. And we did, and we thought we came up with some interesting findings and so on. Now, we decided to go beyond that. And this was not for the conference, but simply for our own fun, almost. We had the data going well beyond 1990. We had the data for the all of 1990s and into the 2000s. We put the numbers into a standard business cycle model constructed on the assumption that everything would be working fine, constructed, calibrated to the Argentine economy, and we had a big surprise. The model said that in light of the productivity increases in Argentina, even in the 1990s, when you saw, as you saw, it looked like Argentina grew pretty fast, it should have grown even faster. The capital stock should have been substantially larger at the end of the century. The decade. Here's an illustration of the contrast between the data in the model. Now, I'll point out that in the previous chart, everything was in terms of GDP per working age person. This is total GDP. So the drop in the 1980s, for example, will not show up as a big drop because at the same time there was also a population increase. These are the data. The model says this is what should have happened to Argentina over this period. Following pretty well the data in the 80s, but in the 90s, the model said that Argentina should have grown substantially faster. I view that as almost like a thermometer. If you had looked at this in the 1990s, you would have said, there must be fever. This patient doesn't have a temperature of 37. This patient has a temperature of maybe 39 or 40. This is a sign of potentially some disease. Even worse, if you look at the best measures of capital, the sum of all the factories and machines and office buildings, all the productive capacity of Argentina, here are the data. This is what the model said should have happened. Investments should have taken place much faster than it did in the 1990s. We take this as a sign that Argentina suffered from a disease. We call it the time inconsistency disease. The disease, I was trying to explain to you the fundamental reasons for it earlier. The reason Argentina suffered from that disease had to do with their past behavior, not because of the way Carlos Menem behaved. He tried to do pretty well given the current situation, given the expectations that existed, but he could not overcome the memories of past hyperinflations, past devaluations, past deposit freezes, past defaults on government obligations. He could not overcome the resulting lack of credibility not just among investors in Argentina, but also among investors in other countries who might think about investing in Argentina. This is a very depressing picture for Argentina. When I first saw it, I thought, oh my God, this is terrible. This is the capital stock per working age person from 1980 until 2003. And as you can see, the peak was around 1981, 82. Since then, into 2003, I suppose I should have updated the numbers, but and I think they had turned around, but by 2003, 20 years later, the capital stock per working age person, per potential worker, the capital stock was 20% lower. Now, the economic implications of that are terrible. It means that it would predict that the real wages, the salaries of workers would be declining over time rather than increasing, as happens in most developed countries. The implications for the poor are likely to be particularly severe. In bad times, the people with higher human capital, higher skills, they tend to do relatively okay. Not as well as if the capital stock had been higher, but they tend to do okay. The poor are the ones who really suffer. And the poverty levels in Argentina had risen steadily over this period. Can Argentina recover? It has recovered in the past 3 or 4 years, but it's not so clear yet that it has recovered for the duration. Argentina tends to focus a lot on the very short run. There's little discussion of what it takes for Argentina to grow in the long run. There's little focus on what policies are needed, what policy environment is needed for the next 5, 10, 20 years, and that's what it takes. Argentina will need to restore its confidence in economics. That's one of the things we know least about. We don't know so much about what it takes. Once you've lost confidence, once you've lost credibility, how can you recover? It's not easy. Let me just spend the last 3 or 4 minutes, maybe, on some more general lessons for policy. I already mentioned the importance of incentives for productivity growth and capital accumulation. Government policy needs to be credible and forward-looking. And this is a good time to take the opposite example, namely that of the Celtic Tiger, Ireland. Ireland, I'm not saying that these are the only 2 factors behind Ireland's success, but they have to have been very important. One is, Ireland had done relatively poorly for decades. Lots of their population had left for other countries, for the United States, for Britain, and so on. They had been losing many of their many of their best educated people. Ireland decided in around 1960 or in the 1960s to make secondary education free of charge. As a consequence, 20 years later, Ireland finds itself with a potentially quite skillful workforce. By 1990, the education level among the population in Ireland was quite high. It's true they didn't have machines with which to put them to use, or their computers, or otherwise technological knowledge to put their potential skill to use. So what did the government do? They made it clear to potential investors, not just within Ireland, but also in other nations, that if you built your capacity to produce in Ireland, this took place around 1990, if you build your capacity in Ireland, the taxes facing you will be so and so, and these were relatively mild taxes. The taxes facing you will be so and so, not just next year when the factories are finished, but also these will be the taxes the year after, up through 2009. For 20 years. On the assumption that this announcement was credible and that there's every indication that it has been credible. I guess Ireland never did anything to try to fool people the way Argentina has done. This was evidently credible, and it removed an important source of uncertainty facing the investors. As a result, Ireland has grown spectacularly for 20 years. We need institutions geared to avoiding the time inconsistency disease. An example of such an institution is the independent central bank to conduct monetary policy, to provide a low inflation environment, which we know is conducive to growth. In the fiscal case, such institutions are less obvious. It's a very important problem, and it's something that some of the brightest economists are thinking about, and I look forward to seeing what they come up with. There are large wealth and income disparities across nations. You already saw that illustrated in my three initial charts, the contrast between the nations in Africa and the other ones I had plotted. Some nations have incomes of less than 1/50th or 1/60th of what the incomes are in the more well-to-do nations. These low incomes are often the result of government policies, country-specific policies that either directly, sometimes directly, but often just indirectly restrict the set of technologies that can be implemented in that country. Often there are vested interests who have the ears of the politicians, and they convince the politicians to impose restrictive policies that would prevent new technologies from being implemented. There's a lot of knowledge available. In this age of globalization, that's one of the benefits, that knowledge travels easily. It can easily travel from the United States or from Europe to Western Asia, Eastern Asia, to Africa, and to Latin America. It can travel all over the world. Now, it doesn't mean that all this knowledge, all this technology can be usefully implemented everywhere. The various nations are different. Some may have better conditions for doing some things than others, but there is that knowledge available, and with some nation-specific innovative activity, there is no reason why, and in the absence of conflicts, of course, these conflicts also scare investors, as could, for example, happen in Pakistan, as we learned recently. They could make these countries suffer in the longer run. I would like to end by paraphrasing the final sentence, I believe, of a very useful book written by Parente and Prescott called Barriers to Riches. It's a very compact book. I think it's on the order of 120 pages long, but it's full of not just theoretical knowledge, but also lots of examples going back, for example, on the history of China, going back thousands of years. Very interesting book. And what they conclude with is, with good policy, there is potential in poor nations for not 1 to 2% increase, but 1,000 to 2,000% income increase. Clearly, they're trying to be a little cute by adding those 3 zeros to each of those digits, but there is something to what they're saying. South Korea showed that it can be done. Their income per capita grew sixfold over a 25-year period. We think of some of these African nations where the income is on the order of $500 per capita, 1,000% increase. That's increasing tenfold. That just brings you up to 5,000. While for the more well-to-do nations, as you saw, we're talking about $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. That should be the minimum over a reasonable 10, 20, or 30-year period. It can be done. It would make life much better in those nations. It would provide conditions for more long-lasting peace. But unfortunately, there are these conflicts. I think peace and economic development are closely connected. In some cases, the causality runs in one direction. In some cases, the causality runs in the other direction. But it's very important to think about economic development, and especially in those less well-to-do nations, to think about what can be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Kydland. We, of course, now will have an open forum, and to start off the open forum, we have given the privilege of asking the first questions to 3 of our students in the economics department who are well on their way to becoming 3 out of 5 expected summa cum laude graduates in March when we have our commencement. So without putting undue pressure on these students, we have given them that opportunity to be asking the first 3 questions. After that, we will be, of course, opening it to everybody else. The usual request applies that when you do ask your question, please introduce yourselves and identify your affiliation for the benefit of Professor Kydland and, of course, the rest of the audience. So may I first call on Ms. Krista Victoria, one of our upcoming summa cum laudes. Please approach the nearest microphone when you do ask your question.
Good afternoon, Professor. Okay, my question is, given the many shocks that are happening in the world today, in particular, what you mentioned earlier, the U.S. subprime mortgage crisis, the looming U.S. recession, oil price hikes, things like that, what policy measures would you recommend?
I don't think there's that much the government can do to avoid the shock if it is to happen. Sometimes if the government tries to interfere in the short run, then things can happen. The resulting outcomes can be bad for the long run. And to me, the long run has always been much more important than the very short run. And so I would be very careful about making specific recommendations. What's going on is the danger is that as a result of this crisis, the banks will become more cautious, maybe more cautious than is in the interest of society as a whole in their financial intermediation. If there's anything central banks could do, if there's anything for them to think about, it would be to try to find ways to minimize the effect, the negative effect on financial intermediation. But what we're likely to see now is a reduction in the nation's productivity for a period of time. Exactly how long that period is likely to last is hard to say, and that probably is reflected in the fluctuations we've seen in the stock market. As I'm sure you all know, when you own a share in the stock market, that means you own a share in that particular company, in its capital, and the value of that share depends on how productive that capital will be in the future, something that's not easy to assess, especially today. The uncertainty introduced because of the subprime mortgage crisis is much greater than we've seen in the past 10 or 15 years. And so the assessments, people are trying to read the signals, the assessments change, and sometimes one sees positive things that might suggest that it's going to be over and not too long. And then another you see some additional bad data coming from somewhere in the world. So I think what it's going to take is to get over this crisis, and then in the long run, I believe, at least for the developed countries, for countries like the United States and European Union countries, Scandinavian countries, and so on, I don't think their ability to produce efficiently will be diminished substantially from this crisis, except initially for it could be 1, 2, hopefully not more than a couple of years, and then they'll be back to working the way we've seen them being able to work when the crisis blows over.
Thank you.
Paul next on Ayan. Let me call first on Paul Cheng, who will be the second of our 3 upcoming economists, summa cum laude. Paul?
Professor, good afternoon. If you don't mind, I'd like to push your talk a little bit into the field of political economy. My question is this: how do you see inter-country political relations in terms of your model? Because I think you're talking about consistency in terms of policy, but I also think that inter-country relations in terms of power play a very important role in this model that you talk about. Can you comment a little bit on how do you see it in that field?
Well, that's a rather broad question, but so I'd like to narrow questions down to more specific examples. And let me just ask you if this is an example. In Europe, for example, if you looked across nations 20 or 30 years ago, or more, 40 years ago, and you talk about their conduct of monetary policy, you had the contrast between the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank was always regarded as one of the most independent and independent-minded central banks in the world. At the same time, in Europe, there were countries like Greece and Italy and Spain where monetary policy, where they were much closer to falling prey to what I call the time inconsistency disease. These countries have now gotten together to conduct monetary policy jointly. If that cooperation can contribute to the commitment of these policies to a low inflation environment, it will clearly be to the best for all of these countries. And it can be debated whether it really benefits Germany much because their monetary policy was already so benign. But I'm sure that for these these three countries around in the Mediterranean, monetary policy is now conducted, or at least has been conducted in the past 20 years, in a much more benign way. So that's an example where countries can maybe get together and jointly try to create a commitment mechanism if it's difficult to do individually.
I think that is a positive example, but I think very recently there is I forget the specific meeting, but there was a meeting on trying to amend the Kyoto Protocol, something like that. So that is on the more negative example where countries do not as easily.
Their monetary policy was already so benign, but I'm sure that for these countries, these three countries around in the Mediterranean, monetary policy is now conducted, or at least has been conducted in the past 20 years, in a much more benign way. So that's an example where countries can maybe get together and jointly try to create a commitment mechanism if it's difficult to do individually.
I think that is a positive example, but I think very recently there is I forget the specific meeting, but there was a meeting on trying to amend the Kyoto Protocol, something like that. So that is on the more negative example where countries do not as easily come together to come up with consistent policies. So maybe the question is how feasible is this model in terms of a world wherein countries do not as easily come together to come up with policies.
The model doesn't make predictions about how you would, or what the nature of the commitment mechanism would be in practice. What it does is it points out this incentive, this unfortunate incentive for policy to change in the future. And it points out the importance of thinking hard about how to avoid that policy change in the future. Exactly how that change will take place will surely, well, as I mentioned, we have come up with ways that have seemed to have been successful in the case of monetary policy or fiscal policy. It's still not so obvious. And whether interaction among countries is likely to make such commitment mechanism easier or harder to come up with. The model doesn't say anything about that. It just says this is the reason, this is the problem, this is very important to think about. Smart people should try to find a solution.
Thank you, Paul. And third, I'd like to call on Diane Xioko.
Hi, sir.
Hello.
In your work, you talked about governments sticking to the rules rather than discretion. I would like to ask if is this applicable in all cases, or are there cases wherein it would be better for governments to change their policies?
I think it's applicable to all cases. You should remember that the rule could be a contingent rule. It could be a rule that says if so and so happens, the policy instrument's value could change. And a good example is the gold standard. The gold standard tied nations' currencies to the price of gold. Now, it was well known that in cases of war, countries would go off the gold standard. In fact, that was the only way for countries in, say, around 1850 or 1860, for example, the United States and their Civil War, was the only way to finance the war as a consequence of the gold standard, with the promise to go back on the gold standard after the war. So you could think of that as an example of a gold standard, of a contingent rule. You're sticking to that rule, but in the contingency of a war, it's understood by everyone that you will depart from the gold standard for a brief period of time. Similar contingencies could be imagined in other circumstances. So I don't think of that as an example of changing the policy. It would be an example of changing the value or changing the instrument. Still well understood by everyone as a result of a contingency that everyone understands. And so that removes even the need to think about changing policy, which would be to change the whole policy rule, and that, or what often happens is that it's decided that now among politicians that now short-term considerations are much more important than this long-term rule. If I may give another example of such a rule, being Norwegian, I'm somewhat familiar with the situation in Norway. Norway has a fortune. They almost struck gold. But they struck black gold. They struck oil in the North Sea about 1970, and since then, Norway has generated considerable revenue that they decided mostly to save for future generations. So they're accumulating an oil fund. This oil fund is now 1 times annual GDP and is projected to grow to 5 times GDP by 2020. It has turned out that regardless of who's in, and they have a decision rule. The decision rule was decided, it says what percent of the oil fund can be used for current expenditures at any point in time. This decision rule the government has stuck to this decision rule regardless of who has been in power, whether the Labour Party was for some 4 or 8 year period, or a coalition of parties in the center or close or more towards the right. That's an example of a rule that is always under pressure, because there will be constituents who will point to the queues at hospitals for surgical procedures and so on. They point to needs for short-term expenditures, but the politicians have stuck to their rules. Such is one of the few examples in the fiscal area where such a rule really has been come up with and been successful. I don't know if I answered your questions.
Sir, you're the best.
Thank you, Dr. Dan. If I may add another comment here, I certainly admire the consistency and the discipline of the Norwegian political leaders. In this country, of course, like in many other free-wheeling democracies, I guess, policy reversals are part of every change in administration. What's worse is policy reversals can happen within the same administration. But anyway, at this point, we would like to open the floor for questions from the general audience. Again, the same request that you please introduce yourself and your affiliation. Yes, please. If there are microphones on the aisles, please just raise your hand and approach the nearest mic.
definition of knowledge, tremendous amount of knowledge we gain from the lecture of distinguished. I agree completely with the first part of the lecture, as well as with the last part. I think it is with the middle part where I'm not too sure I really understood the theoretical framework of the argument. I think that the private sector as an objective function is very clear. It is maximizing profit, implying maximization of revenue and or minimization of cost. The primal and the dual are consistent. Result, maximum profit at minimum cost. Now, Professor said that the government also has an objective and is also subject to a budget constraint. Now, that seems very easy to accept, except that the professor did not make clear what exactly is the government trying to maximize. Certainly, if you solve the dual of that the government is trying to minimize cost, the mathematics will fail because, not just in the Philippines but in other countries as well, governments do not minimize cost. Departments, when they make savings at the end of the year, immediately go into a frenzy to spend it all because if they do not, the following year their budget will be reduced. Hence, saving instead of being rewarded as it is in the private sector as an index of efficiency, in the public sector it is punished. So, what exactly is the government trying to maximize? What is the mathematical formulation of its objective function? I think until this is clarified, issues like the three kids have raised will persist. But the points of the three students, I think arises from a difficult, there is a bit of illogical illogicity somewhere, but I must be corrected if I'm wrong. The professor said, and this goes to question number one, number two. The professor said that in the econometric studies of the various countries, they found that optimality is achieved by policy that is inconsistent over time. Implying by that it is correct to be inconsistent. Because to be inconsistent yields optimality at the end, on the one hand. But on the other hand, the professor also says, time inconsistency is a disease. And goes into a criticism of policies that are inconsistent. Question, are policies that are inconsistent over time wrong? They have to be right, since, as the professor said, they result in optimality.
That was Dr. Gonzalo Horado, by the way. He's still at the Philippine Institute for Development Studies.
Notice that I said that this finding comes out when we make certain assumptions about objectives being unchanged over time. In our theoretical models, just to make things very striking, we can set up environments that are quite realistic, but we guide the environment in particular directions to make sure that people don't think the result comes from sources that you might be a little suspicious about. And so when we set up an economy, for example, inhabited by millions of people, we can choose to make people immortal. We can choose to make everyone in a model alike. Of course, they aren't alike, and then afterwards you have to see if there are any problems arising from the heterogeneity. In this case, the time and consistency result would also arise in a theoretical model in which everyone is alike. If everyone is alike, the objective of the government is obvious. The government would simply maximize the same utility function that the typical person maximizes. So that's what I mean by a benign government, a government that tries its best to behave in the interest of the people. In spite of that objective function being unchanging and being the same as the objective function of the typical person in the economy, this result arises. Sometime in the future, there will be, or any time in the future, there will be this incentive or perhaps tendency for the government to be inconsistent. And it happens because of, because of the interaction between, because of the importance of future government policy for current decisions by private households and businesses.
You mentioned a while ago government policy having to be credible and forward-looking. Do you have any assessment with regard to the Philippine government policy?
Yes, it should be credible and forward-looking.
What's your assessment, sir? What's your assessment? How would you assess the policy of the present administration?
Aren't I supposed to be polite in the... All I can say is maybe I didn't do my homework before I came to the Philippines, so I have to admit I didn't know much about economic policy in the Philippines, except for its contribution to my first chart.
What do you think should...
Well, let me finish. So, I have learned a fair amount after I got here, and yesterday I gave a talk at which there were two commentators, and I learned quite a bit about economic policy in the Philippines from those two commentators. And especially what one of them mentioned didn't sound too good. I mean, it didn't sound consistent with the credibility and forward-lookingness, or I would rather say the emphasis on a consistent policy with the long run in mind. But I haven't really studied this person.
Which areas do you think should the Philippine government
work? Excuse me. I think it's probably not very productive to keep pursuing that question, given the constraints that Professor Kydland has been under. So thank you very much. Maybe by way of trying to address that question, I would like to invite you to watch out for my next column. Unfortunately, in a rival newspaper. I will be addressing. I do intend to address implications for the Philippines on the topic of question. Yes, please. Very quickly. I can kindly introduce yourself, please.
I am Professor Emmanuel Fernando from UP College of Law and the Department of Philosophy. Unlike Dr. Herrado, I cannot claim to understand or appreciate most of your lecture, since I am not an economist myself. But as to the little I understood, may I ask this question? You stated that low income is often the result of country-specific policies that restrict a set of technologies that can be used. My question is, isn't it the case that third world countries have no choice, given the fact that they're so far behind the first world countries with respect to technology available to them is that they have very few options left. Moreover, they have to compete with many other third world countries over the same area. And therefore, perhaps your claim that you can expect much growth to result from a policy of this sort is perhaps misguided.
I think it's too pessimistic to simply give up. I'm not saying that they should necessarily, or especially in the beginning, aim to use exactly the same policies, technologies that are used in say, the United States or Britain or Germany. Each country has a particular set of resources, they have a particular set of talents, they have a particular configuration. Argentina, as an example, it has a tremendous resource base, and I see no reason why Argentina should fall so far behind, other than, unfortunately, because of their unwise economic policies. In the beginning, presumably you wouldn't be that ambitious in what you try to do. It could even be things like, if your land is particularly fertile, but scarce in relation to the population, you might, even learning what are the best seeds to use or for that nature would fall in the category with what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, there are, I suppose this is where the possibility of conflicts comes in. The incentives for doing so will not be there until you feel that the peacefulness in the future is assured. And when that happens, and also, unfortunately, also in some countries, there is too much corruption. Whatever resources there are, the benefits fall to very few people. Those are examples of conditions that are not in place for long-run development. And I just think that something can be done about them. And many countries have shown that it can be done, and they shouldn't give up.
Well, I think the sorry.
Can follow up?
It has to be very, very quick. Professor Chin is under very tight time constraints today.
For example, sir, I not that we should give up. But for example, the Philippines, we're often reduced to either exporting manpower or service industries or business process outsourcing, and we cannot compete, for example, in many other industries. We try to be as imaginative as we can, but our choice options are limited.
Based on what I heard today, the Philippines has a tremendous amount of resources. They also, I think of it as a resource to have an educated population. I'm sure I can see lots of resources right in front of me. You don't try necessarily to compete with the rest of the world in everything, but with the right amount of innovation and the right amount of trust that you'll get to keep the benefits from the expense today. You'll get to keep the benefits in the form of a stream of income in the future. In such an environment, I think the innovation